At the reading of my husband's will, my daughter leaned over and smirked. "You'll get nothing from Dad's 20 million. He left it to the person who understands business." She thought I was just a quiet academic wife who knew nothing of the empire he built. She didn't know that the lawyer was about to read a single sentence detailing a private multi-million-dollar debt the estate owed to me, his silent partner, a debt that would make her entire inheritance disappear. Before I begin, I just want to say, thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. My name is Beatrice Monroe. For 45 years, my life was a quiet conversation with the past. As the head archivist for the Savannah Historical Society, my world was one of hushed rooms, the scent of aging paper, and the sacred duty of preserving the stories that time tries to erase. I have held in my gloved hands the brittle, ink-stained letters of Civil War soldiers. I have traced the faded property lines on pre-colonial maps, and I have felt the weight of history in the heavy, leather-bound ledgers of forgotten merchants. I am a woman who understands that the truth is often not found in the grand, sweeping narratives, but in the quiet, dusty details, in the footnotes, and the forgotten addendums. Today, I am the subject of a footnote. I sit in the historic, oak-paneled boardroom of Elias Thorne, my late husband's lawyer and oldest friend. The room, which overlooks one of Savannah's beautiful, moss-draped squares, feels like an extension of my own archive, a place of quiet, weighty tradition. We are here for the reading of the will of my husband of 45 years, Samuel Monroe. My grief is a quiet, well-mannered guest, sitting beside me, a heavy but familiar presence. I am a widow, a new, and ill-fitting, title. Across the vast, polished mahogany table sits my daughter, Jasmine. At 40 she is a vision of sharp, corporate success. Her suit is a tailored slash of charcoal gray. Her jewelry is understated and expensive, and her grief is a thin, transparent performance. She checks her phone, her thumb swiping impatiently across the screen, a small, irritated sigh escaping her lips. She is not mourning a father. She is attending a business meeting, the final, and most profitable, one of her father's life. She looks at me, and her eyes, so much like her father's in their sharp intelligence, hold none of his warmth. They hold only a cool, dismissive pity. To Jasmine, I am a relic, a quaint, academic woman who, through the sheer luck of marriage, stumbled into a life of luxury she could never have achieved on her own. She sees my quiet dignity as weakness, my composure as the placid resignation of a woman who knows her time in the sun is over. She has no concept of the life I lived alongside her father, of the partnership that was the true cornerstone of his success. She sees only the public man, Samuel Monroe, the real estate titan, and his quiet, decorative wife. She is about to learn, in the most public and permanent way possible, that the most important truths are always hidden in the archives. To understand the document that now sits before Elias Thorne, you must travel back 30 years, to a damp, musty subbasement in the Savannah Historical Society. It was a place few people ever entered, a forgotten repository of the city's mundane, unglamorous past. It was my sanctuary. Samuel, at that time, was a successful but still regional developer. He was ambitious, but he was hitting a wall. The prime real estate in Savannah was locked up, held for generations by old families, its ownership a tangled web of heirlooms and handshake agreements. He was looking for an edge, a way to break into the next tier of success. I found that edge for him, not in a boardroom, but in a dusty, forgotten property ledger from the 1890s. I was in the sub-basement, researching a paper on post-Reconstruction commercial zoning, when I stumbled upon it. The ledger was massive, its leather cover cracked and flaking, its pages brittle with age. It was a record of the city's industrial waterfront, an area that was, in the present day, a vast, derelict wasteland of crumbling warehouses and rotting piers. It was considered worthless, a blighted, unsalvageable scar on the city's beautiful face. As I carefully turned the pages, my archivist's eye caught an anomaly. A series of meticulous, hand-drawn survey maps from 1892, cross-referenced with the city's official zoning records from the same year. And then I saw it. A discrepancy. A massive, 20-acre parcel of land, the very heart of the derelict waterfront, had been, due to a clerical error a century ago, miszoned. It was listed on the city's modern maps as industrial wasteland, but the original, legally binding charter from the 1890s had it zoned for mixed commercial and residential use. The city had forgotten its own history. My heart began to pound. I spent the next week in a fever of research, cross-referencing deeds, charters, and city council minutes from 100 years ago. The truth was undeniable. The land was not worthless. It was a gold mine. The original zoning gave its owner the right to build hotels, condos, restaurants, a right no other developer thought was possible. That evening, I laid out my findings for Samuel on our dining room table. He looked at the old maps, at my notes, his initial skepticism slowly melting into a look of pure, unadulterated awe. "Beatrice," he whispered, his voice thick with reverence. "How in God's name did you find this?" "You have to know where to look, Samuel," I had replied. "The best secrets are always hidden in the footnotes." Armed with my research, Samuel moved with a quiet, lethal precision. He used a series of shell corporations to discreetly buy up the individual, seemingly worthless parcels of land from their disparate, uninterested owners. He acquired the entire 20 acres for a pittance, pennies on the dollar of its true value. Then he went to the city with my file of historical documents. The city's lawyers, faced with the irrefutable, century-old evidence of their own error, had no choice but to honor the original zoning. The news sent a shockwave through the Savannah real estate community. Samuel Monroe, overnight, became a legend. The Riverfront Revival Project, with its luxury hotel, its high-end condos, its chic restaurants and boutiques, became the cornerstone of his $20 million fortune. And it was all built on a secret from the archives, a secret that only I could have found. That night, after the city had confirmed the zoning, Samuel came to me, his eyes shining with a gratitude so profound it was almost a form of worship. "This wasn't my deal, B," he'd said. "It was yours. This fortune, it's ours." It was a promise I believed he would always honor. Back in the present, the air in Elias Thorne's boardroom was thick with the weight of unspoken history. Elias, a man whose friendship with my late husband was a tapestry of 50 years of shared confidences and business dealings, sat at the head of the table. He was a picture of old-world Savannah grace, his silver hair perfectly combed, his dark suit impeccably tailored. But his eyes, as they met mine, held a look of profound, sorrowful understanding. He was not just an executor. He was a custodian of my husband's final, and most complex, legacy. He cleared his throat, the sound a soft, polite disruption in the heavy silence. "We are gathered here today," he began, his voice a low, resonant baritone, "to execute the last will and testament of my dear friend and client, Samuel Ellison Monroe. This document was prepared by me, in accordance with his specific and detailed instructions, and was signed and witnessed on the 15th of June of last year." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. He looked from my calm, composed face to my daughter's, which was a mask of impatient, barely concealed avarice. Jasmine shifted in her chair, the rustle of her expensive suit, a sharp, jarring sound. "Elias, can we just get on with it?" She said, her tone less that of a grieving daughter and more that of a busy executive with a plane to catch. "I have a conference call at 3. I'm sure my mother is as eager as I am to have this settled." Elias's expression did not change, but I saw a flicker of distaste in his eyes. He had known Jasmine since she was a child. He had watched her grow from a bright, ambitious girl into this cold, hard, transactional woman. "Of course, Jasmine," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Patience is a virtue, but business is business." The subtle, perfectly delivered rebuke was lost on her. He picked up the will. It was a thick, heavy document, bound in a simple, dark blue cover. He untied the ribbon that held it together, his movements slow and deliberate. Every gesture was imbued with a sense of ceremony, a respect for the gravity of the moment that was so starkly absent in my daughter. He put on a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses and looked down at the first page. "I, Samuel Ellison Monroe," he began to read, his voice filling the quiet room, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils. He read through the preliminary clauses, the standard, boilerplate language of any legal will. He detailed the small bequests to distant relatives, the charitable donations to the Historic Preservation Society, the instructions for his own funeral, which we had just attended. I listened, my hands folded calmly in my lap. My heart was a steady, quiet rhythm in my chest. I felt no anxiety, no suspense. I had lived a life with Samuel built on a foundation of love and mutual respect. I had been his partner, his confidant, his secret weapon. I had no reason to doubt that he had honored that partnership in his final act. Jasmine, however, was practically vibrating with a restless, coiled energy. She tapped her pen against a leather-bound notepad she had placed on the table. She checked her watch, a slim, diamond-encrusted Cartier, a gift from her wealthy husband. She was enduring this tedious preamble, waiting for the only part that mattered to her. The disposition of the main estate. The $20 million. She believed it was her birthright, the just reward for being the daughter of a great man. She had no idea that the will was not a coronation, but a final, posthumous lesson from her father on the true meaning of value. Elias Thorne turned a page, the soft rustle of the thick, watermarked paper the only sound in the room. He paused, looking over the top of his glasses at the two of us. This was it, the main event, the disposition of the assets. Jasmine, sensing the shift, put down her pen. She leaned forward, her entire body a coiled spring of anticipation. Her mask of bored impatience was gone, replaced by a raw, undisguised hunger. Her eyes were fixed on Elias, but her energy, a palpable wave of triumphant, condescending pity, was directed entirely at me. It was in this moment of charged silence, just as Elias was about to read the clause that would define the rest of our lives, that Jasmine chose to deliver her final, cruelest blow. She leaned across the polished mahogany table, creating a small, intimate space between us, a bubble of conspiracy in the formal, legal atmosphere. She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, a sound laced with a sweet, venomous poison. "I hope you enjoyed the ride, Mother." She breathed, a small, cruel smirk playing on her lips. "You'll get nothing from Dad's $20 million will. He left it all to the person who actually understands business." The words were a perfect, surgical strike, designed to inflict the maximum possible pain and humiliation. Each part of the sentence was a separate, carefully sharpened blade. "I hope you enjoyed the ride." The implication was clear. My 45-year marriage had been nothing more than a long, luxurious vacation that I had not earned, a ride on her father's coattails that was now, officially, over. "You'll get nothing." A blunt, brutal declaration of my impending poverty, my fall from grace. He left it all to the person who actually understands business. This was the deepest cut. It was a direct, contemptuous dismissal of my life's work, of my intelligence, of my crucial, hidden role in the very fortune she was about to claim. It was the final assertion of her own superiority, her belief that she, the ruthless corporate attorney, was the true and worthy heir to her father's legacy, while I, the quiet, academic archivist, was nothing more than a historical footnote. She delivered the lines with the cool, confident malice of a villain in the final act of a play, a villain who knows she has already won. She expected me to crumble. She wanted to see the mask of my dignified grief crack, to see the raw, helpless pain of a woman who has just been told she has been left with nothing. She wanted to savor my devastation before it was officially announced. I did not give her the satisfaction. I simply met her gaze, my own expression calm, my heart a steady, unbothered rhythm. I did not flinch, I did not speak. I simply held her gaze until she, unnerved by my lack of a reaction, was forced to look away. I then turned my serene, attentive expression back to Elias Thorne, who had watched the entire, whispered exchange with a look of profound, weary disgust. I gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Proceed." My composure was not an act of strength. It was an act of knowledge. Jasmine believed she was delivering a prophecy of my doom. She had no idea she was merely stating the premise of a lecture in which she was about to be the primary and most humiliated student. Elias Thorne, his expression now a mask of stern, judicial neutrality, looked down at the will. He had witnessed Jasmine's cruel whisper, and his voice, when he began to read again, had a new, hard edge to it. The sound of a man who was about to take a great and solemn pleasure in the execution of his duty. "We now come to the primary bequest," he announced, his voice filling the silent room. Article 4. Disposition of the residuary estate. Jasmine sat back in her chair, the smug, triumphant smirk returning to her face. She crossed her arms, a posture of absolute, unshakable confidence. She looked at me, her eyes shining with a final, pitying condescension. This was it, the official confirmation of her victory. Elias cleared his throat and read from the document. "I, Samuel Ellison Monroe, do hereby give, devise, and bequeath the entirety of my residuary estate, including all real and personal property, all stocks, bonds, and securities, and all assets held in any and all financial accounts to my beloved and brilliant daughter, Jasmine Monroe Sterling, to be hers absolutely and forever." The words, so clear, so absolute, so final, hung in the air. Jasmine's smile widened into a broad, triumphant grin. She had done it. She had won. The entire $20 million fortune was hers. She visibly relaxed, a wave of pure, unadulterated relief and victory washing over her. She turned her gaze to me, her expression now one of almost theatrical sympathy. It was the look of a new queen, offering a moment of magnanimous pity to the deposed, Dowager Empress. She was, I am sure, preparing her next set of remarks, perhaps a hollow offer to make sure I was taken care of, or a condescending suggestion that she could help me find a nice, small apartment. I simply met her gaze, my own expression unchanging. I offered her a small, quiet, and completely unreadable smile. My calm, my utter lack of devastation, seemed to unnerve her more than any outburst could have. She had just been handed an empire, and I was looking at her as if she had just won a game of checkers. Elias Thorne did not pause. He did not look up. He simply continued to the next paragraph, his voice a steady, relentless monotone. He was a man who knew that the most devastating blows are often delivered not with a shout, but with the quiet, inexorable march of procedural language. The main act was over, but the denouement, the part of the play that would change everything, was just beginning. Elias Thorne finished reading the main bequest and paused. He took off his reading glasses and began to polish them with a small, silk handkerchief, a deliberate, theatrical gesture that immediately recaptured the room's attention. Jasmine, who had been basking in the warm glow of her $20 million inheritance, looked at him with a flicker of annoyance. In her mind, the meeting was over. All that remained was the signing of papers and the transfer of funds. Elias placed his glasses back on, his movements slow and precise. He looked over the top of them, first at a beaming Jasmine, and then at me, my face a mask of serene composure. "A very clear and generous bequest," he said, his voice a calm, neutral statement of fact. "Samuel was always very clear in his intentions. He loved you a great deal, Jasmine, and he was immensely proud of your professional success." Jasmine preened, accepting the compliment as her due. "Thank you, Elias," she said, her voice magnanimous. "My father and I had a very special bond. We understood each other. We understood the world of business. The implicit contrast with me, the unbusinesslike mother, was not lost on anyone in the room." "Indeed," Elias said, his expression unreadable. He then tapped a long, elegant finger on the page of the will in front of him. "However," he continued, and the single word, so quiet and so casual, seemed to suck all the air out of the room. "The will is very specific, and your father, as you say, was a meticulous man. That bequest, the one I have just read, is entirely contingent upon the fulfillment of one, single, preceding clause. A clause that legally and financially defines the very nature of the estate itself." Jasmine's smile faltered. The triumphant light in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a look of wary confusion. "A clause? What are you talking about? A definition of the estate? That's just legal boilerplate, isn't it? Assets minus liabilities." "In a sense," Elias replied smoothly. "But in this case, The definition of the estate's liabilities is rather unique. Your father wanted to ensure there was no ambiguity, no room for misinterpretation. He felt he had one, very significant, outstanding obligation that had to be settled before any inheritance could be calculated. He looked directly at Jasmine, his gaze, now as sharp and penetrating as a surgeon's scalpel. Before we can determine the value of what you have inherited, Jasmine, he said, his voice dropping slightly, we must first address the matter of what your father owed. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. The warm, celebratory glow of Jasmine's victory had been extinguished, replaced by a cold, uneasy chill. She was no longer a triumphant heiress, she was a litigant, a party in a dispute she didn't understand. She looked from Elias's stern, unyielding face to my calm, unreadable one, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine, undiluted fear appeared in her eyes. The solid ground of her $20 million inheritance had just begun to tremble beneath her feet. Jasmine's arrogance, though shaken, was not yet broken. She was a corporate attorney, a woman who lived in a world of contracts and clauses. She saw this as a last-minute, annoying legal wrinkle, a piece of sentimental nonsense her father had insisted on including, which she would now have to deal with before she could claim her prize. An obligation? She scoffed, recovering a sliver of her former condescension. Elias, my father was the most financially solvent man in the state of Georgia. He hadn't owed anyone a dime in 30 years. What is this? A sentimental bequest to an old friend? A last-minute charitable pledge? Not exactly, Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous calm. He looked down at the will, at the clause that preceded the main bequest. He cleared his throat, a small, formal sound that seemed to echo in the silent, tension-filled room. And then he read the sentence, the one, single, devastating sentence upon which the entire $20 million will was predicated. His voice was clear, steady, and devoid of all emotion. He read the words exactly as Samuel had written them. This entire will is predicated on the legal and financial definition of my estate, which shall be calculated as the total assets acquired during my lifetime, minus all legally documented debts and private obligations owed at the time of my death. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. To Jasmine, they still sounded like standard legal language, the kind of phrase she herself had probably written into 100 different contracts. She still didn't understand. She was looking at the words, but she was not seeing their meaning. Elias looked up from the page, his gaze locking with hers. The key phrase here, Jasmine, he said, his voice as patient as a professor explaining a complex theorem to a struggling student, is private obligations. Your father felt he had one such obligation that was so significant, so foundational to his entire life's work, that it had to be honored above all others. An obligation that, legally, superseded even his bequest to you. The fear in Jasmine's eyes was now mingled with a profound, frustrated confusion. What private obligation? She demanded, her voice rising. Who? He didn't owe anyone anything. Elias did not answer her question directly. He simply looked at me, a long, meaningful look of profound, 45-year-old respect. And in his eyes, I saw a silent apology for the pain I had endured, and a quiet, triumphant promise of the justice that was about to be served. The one sentence had been read. The legal premise had been established. The trap, so carefully and meticulously constructed by my late husband, was now set. And my daughter, in her arrogance and her ignorance, was about to walk right into it. Jasmine's patience, a commodity she possessed in very small quantities, was now completely exhausted. She saw this entire proceeding as a deliberate, theatrical waste of her valuable time. She was the heiress to a $20 million fortune, and this old, sentimental friend of her father's was dragging out the process with what she could only assume was a pointless, legalistic flourish. Elias, for God's sake, what is this? She snapped, her voice sharp with the arrogance of a woman who believes she is the smartest person in any room. A private obligation? This is ridiculous. My father had no debts. He was the most meticulous man in Georgia. His books were immaculate. I should know. I've reviewed his corporate filings for the past 10 years. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms in a posture of defiant superiority. What is this, Elias? Some legal boilerplate? A loophole you're trying to use to inflate your executor fees? Just tell me what this supposed obligation is so we can dispense with it, and I can get back to my life. Her condescension was breathtaking. She was not just dismissing the premise, she was insulting the integrity of a man who had been her father's closest friend, a man who had known her since the day she was born. Elias Thorne did not react to her insult. He simply absorbed it, his expression unchanging. He was a man who had faced down far more formidable opponents than this spoiled, arrogant woman. He let her words hang in the air, their ugliness and their ignorance exposed in the quiet, dignified room. Your father's corporate books were indeed immaculate, Jasmine, he said, his voice a low, dangerous calm. But this was not a corporate obligation. This was, as the will so clearly states, a private one, a matter of personal honor. And you are correct. Your father was the most meticulous man in Georgia. Which is precisely why he made sure this particular obligation was documented with the same rigor and legal precision as any of his multi-million-dollar real estate deals. He then did something that shifted the entire dynamic of the room. He calmly, and with a great sense of ceremony, reached into the handsome, well-worn leather briefcase that sat on the floor beside his chair. His movements were slow, deliberate, the movements of a man who is about to produce the single, irrefutable piece of evidence that will win his case. He placed a second, older-looking, leather-bound ledger on the table. It was not a modern, corporate binder. It was an old-fashioned, high-quality accounting book, the kind one might find in a 19th-century counting house. Its dark green leather was soft with age, its corners worn smooth. It was a document that radiated a sense of history, of permanence, of a long and solemn accounting. Samuel was indeed meticulous, Elias repeated, his voice a quiet, powerful rumble. Which is why, for 45 years, he kept a private, legally notarized record of his single greatest business obligation, an obligation he felt was so foundational to his success that he referred to it, in his own words, as his cornerstone debt. He placed his hand on the cover of the old ledger. This, he announced to the silent, stunned room, is that record. Jasmine stared at the ledger, her arrogant smirk finally, completely, gone. It had been replaced by a look of profound, dawning horror. She was a lawyer. She understood the power of a document. And she knew, with a sudden, sickening certainty, that whatever was inside that old, leather-bound book was about to destroy her entire world. Elias Thorne opened the ledger. The old, heavy paper made a soft, whispering sound in the silent boardroom, a sound like ghosts telling their secrets. The pages were filled with my late husband's distinctive, elegant handwriting, each entry a testament to a 45-year-old secret. This document, Elias began, his voice taking on the formal narrative tone of an archivist presenting a priceless artifact, is a legally binding consultancy and partnership agreement, drafted and signed by Samuel Ellison Monroe and Beatrice Alston Monroe on the date of their marriage, September 12, 1978. He turned the ledger around so that Jasmine could see the first page. There, in faded but perfectly legible ink, were the signatures of her father and me, alongside the signature of a notary public. As you know, Jasmine, Elias continued, his gaze now fixed on her. Your father built his empire by acquiring and developing historically significant, but often overlooked properties. What you may not know is that the key to his success, the secret ingredient that allowed him to identify these properties before any of his competitors, was your mother. He looked at me, a warm, respectful smile touching his lips. Beatrice, in her role as the head archivist for the Savannah Historical Society, had access to a world of information that was invisible to the public. She had the unique skill set required to navigate the labyrinth of our city's past. And she and your father had an arrangement. He turned his attention back to the ledger. He read aloud from the preamble, in Samuel's own, handwritten words. In recognition of the fact that my beloved wife, Beatrice, through her unique and brilliant archival research, is the true source of the strategic intelligence upon which my business is built, I hereby acknowledge a standing, private, and legally binding debt to her for her invaluable services as my primary consultant and silent partner. Life, Jasmine's face, which had been pale, was now a ghastly, chalky white. The foundation of her entire worldview that her mother was a quaint, lucky, and unintelligent woman who had contributed nothing to the family fortune was being systematically demolished before her eyes. "This was not a sentimental document, Jasmine," Elias said, his voice sharp. "This was a business agreement. Your father was a pragmatist. He knew that Beatrice's contribution was not one of wifely support, but of direct, professional, and highly valuable consulting work. And he insisted on documenting it as such. The ledger was not just a record of a debt. It was a 45-year-long testament to my true role in our marriage. It was the secret history of our partnership, the one Samuel had kept hidden out of a complex mixture of love, pride, and, I now realized, a profound and prescient understanding of his own daughter's character. He had known, even then, that one day, this document might be necessary to protect me, to ensure that my contribution to his empire was not just recognized, but legally and financially compensated. Elias Thorne began to turn the pages of the ledger, each page a separate, devastating blow to Jasmine's reality. The document was not a simple IOU. It was a detailed, meticulous, and legally structured partnership agreement, a secret history of the Monroe fortune that had been running in parallel to the public one for nearly half a century. "The agreement your parents made was quite specific," Elias explained, his voice a calm, relentless narrative. "For every major property acquisition that was initiated based on Beatrice's archival research, she was to be credited with a consultancy and finder's fee. This fee was calculated as a percentage of the net profit realized from the eventual sale or development of that property. It was, in essence, a commission structure, the kind any high-level consultant would command." He stopped at a particular page, a page I remembered well. "Let's take, for example, the Riverfront Revival Project," he said, looking at Jasmine. "The cornerstone of your father's fortune. The public story is that Samuel had a brilliant vision for that derelict land. The private, documented story is this." He read from the ledger, his finger tracing Samuel's elegant script, entry dated May 14th, 1993. Property, the Savannah waterfront parcel, 20 acres. Origin of lead, archival research conducted by B. Monroe, identifying a century-old zoning error. Consultancy fee agreement, 50% of all net profits derived from this project, to be held as a standing debt on my private ledger. Jasmine made a small, choking sound. The Riverfront project alone had generated profits in excess of $10 million over the years. Elias turned another page. "Or the Forsyth Park Hotel conversion," he said. "A property that had been tied up in a complex probate dispute for 50 years. He read again. Entry dated June 20, 2001. Property, the old Duren House on Forsyth Park. Origin of lead, B. Monroe's discovery of a lost heirs will in the county archives, which allowed us to clear the title, consultancy fee agreement, 40% of net profit." He continued, page after damning page. The historic warehouse district he had turned into luxury lofts. The abandoned cotton exchange he had transformed into a boutique hotel, each one, a major triumph in Samuel's public career. And each one, in the private ledger, was meticulously credited to a specific piece of my archival research, with a corresponding, legally binding percentage of the profits assigned to me as a debt. It was a 45-year paper trail. A secret, parallel accounting of the Monroe Empire. It documented, in my husband's own hand, that I was not just a supportive wife. I was the chief architect of his success. I was the source of his greatest deals. I was his silent, and most profitable, partner. Every year, Elias said, his voice now a low, powerful conclusion, on their wedding anniversary, Samuel and I would meet. We would review this ledger. He would update it with any new deals. And he and I would both sign and notarize the summary page, affirming the total outstanding debt. It was his most important piece of estate planning. He looked at Jasmine, whose face was now a mask of utter, complete devastation. Your father was a brilliant man, Jasmine, he said, his voice softening with a hint of pity. But he was also a just man. He knew where his fortune truly came from, and he was determined, in his final act, to honor his single greatest debt. The ledger was not just a list of deals. It was a narrative of our life together, told through the cold, hard language of finance. Each entry was a memory, a story of a shared victory that Jasmine had never been privy to. As Elias continued to turn the pages, I was transported back in time, to the late nights spent poring over dusty maps, to the thrill of discovery, to the quiet, shared triumphs that had been the true foundation of my marriage. Elias paused on an entry from the early 2000s. The Gadsden Wharf project, he announced. A particularly complex acquisition. I remembered it well. It was a series of abandoned shipping warehouses that were believed to be historically insignificant. But I, in my research, had discovered that they were some of the first fireproof constructions in the city, built with a unique, experimental brick. This historical detail, which I had unearthed from the builder's private journal in the Society's archives, allowed Samuel to get the properties listed on the National Register of Historic Places, opening up millions of dollars in federal tax credits for their restoration. Elias read Samuel's entry, Gadsden Wharf Acquisition. Lead and historical justification provided entirely by B. Monroe's research into 19th century construction techniques. This deal would have been impossible without her. Consultancy fee, 50% of tax credit value plus 30% of net profit upon sale of the restored units. Jasmine, the corporate attorney, would have understood the brutal, financial genius of that deal. She would have understood that the tax credits alone were worth a fortune. And that fortune, as the ledger proved, was built on my intellectual labor. Elias turned another page. The Mercer House stables, he said. A small but incredibly profitable deal. I smiled at the memory. It was a small crumbling carriage house behind one of Savannah's famous historic homes. It had a clouded title, with ownership disputed by 3 different branches of a feuding family. But I, in my research into the family's genealogy, had found a forgotten prenuptial agreement from the 1880s that clearly assigned the carriage house to one specific branch of the family. Armed with that document, Samuel had been able to approach the true owners, a branch of the family that had no idea they even owned the property, and buy it for a song. He had turned it into the most exclusive private guest house in the city. The ledger was a relentless, page-by-page deconstruction of the myth of Samuel Monroe, the lone genius. It replaced that myth with the truth of Samuel and Beatrice Monroe, the formidable partnership. It was a truth that had been hidden in plain sight for 45 years. Every entry was signed by Samuel. Every annual summary page was signed by both Samuel and Elias, and bore the embossed, undeniable seal of a notary public. It was a legally unassailable document. It was not a diary. It was not a sentimental gesture. It was a private, but legally binding, accounting of a lifetime of debt. A debt of honor, a debt of partnership, and a debt that was now, finally, about to be called in. Elias Thorne finally arrived at the last page of the ledger. The page was dated June 15th of the previous year, the same day Samuel had signed his final will. This was the final, notarized summary of his life's greatest obligation. The boardroom was so quiet I could hear the frantic, shallow sound of my daughter's breathing. She was no longer a smug, confident heiress. She was a defendant, waiting for the judge to deliver her sentence. Elias put on his reading glasses one last time. He looked at the page, then up at Jasmine, his expression one of solemn finality. As per the agreement, he began, his voice a formal, tolling bell, the outstanding consultancy fees were to accrue interest annually, at a rate tied to the prime lending rate, as a reflection of their status as a long-term, uninvested debt owed to Mrs. Monroe. He ran his finger down a column of numbers, a column that represented 45 years of compounded interest, a testament to the quiet, relentless power of time. After a full and final accounting, conducted by me and your father on the date, this was signed, he continued, the total value of this outstanding private debt, the single, primary obligation owed by the estate of Samuel Ellison Monroe to Mrs. Beatrice Alston Monroe. He paused, letting the weight of the moment build to an almost unbearable tension. He then looked directly at Jasmine, and he delivered the final, devastating number. Is calculated, with all accrued interest, at $21,500,000. The number landed in the silent room, with the force of a physical explosion. $21.5 million. The math was simple. The math was brutal. The math was undeniable. The estate was worth $20 million. The primary debt owed by the estate was $21.5 million. The estate was not just solvent, it was in debt. It was underwater. And the sole, primary creditor, the person to whom all the assets were now legally and contractually owed, was me. I had not been left with nothing. I had been left with everything. Jasmine stared at Elias, her mouth slightly agape, her sharp, legal mind frantically trying to find a loophole, an angle, a way out of the perfect, ironclad trap her father had built for her. But there was none. The will was clear. The ledger was notarized. The debt was absolute. The entire foundation of her life, her identity as the brilliant, wealthy daughter of a self-made man, had been a lie. Her father was not a lone genius. Her mother was not a quaint, lucky fool. And her inheritance, the $20 million prize she had been so sure was hers, had just vanished into thin air, revealed to be nothing more than an accounting error. Her face, which had been flushed with triumphant arrogance just minutes before, turned a ghastly, chalky, and utterly bloodless white. It was the face of a person who has just seen a ghost, the ghost of a fortune she never really had. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a new, terrifying emotion. It was not anger. It was not hatred. It was a look of pure, unadulterated awe. She was finally seeing me, for the first time in her life. Not as her mother, but as the woman who had just, without raising her voice, without shedding a tear, inherited an entire empire out from under her nose. I did not offer her a word of comfort. I did not offer her a gesture of reconciliation. I simply gave her a small, sad, and final smile. It was a smile of pity, not for her loss of the money, but for her profound and tragic inability to have ever understood the true nature of its source. I stood up, my movements calm and graceful. I smoothed the front of my black dress. The business of the day was concluded. Thank you for your time, Elias, I said, my voice quiet but firm. You have executed my husband's wishes perfectly. I turned and walked towards the door of the boardroom. I did not look back at my daughter. There was nothing more to say. She had been so sure I would get nothing. And in a way, she was right. I had not inherited a thing. I had simply come to collect on a debt that had, at long last, been paid in full.